Well, hello, my friend Mary. How are you today?
I'm so good. Shanti Joy Gold. Happy to be here.
Can't figure out a better way to start the new year. I don't normally allude to the time because who knows exactly when these will air, but I'm just here on the first work day of 2025 with you and couldn't be happier. So thank you so much for doing this with me.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Yeah, it's full circle. Mary was kind enough to host the very first episode of Stories We Haven't Shared, where the tables were turned on me, as I like to say, as they will be again today. I every so often will be popping in to be the interviewee, and I'm excited about that. And it's really hard for me to believe that I'm 3+ months in and just previously released my 10th episode. Just excited to be back here with you and looking ahead to the coming year for the podcast and just life in general.
Love it. I love it. We're in double digits, everyone. So that's exciting.
Indeed. And I do need to reference my voice. I am doing my annual get together with the family at the holidays and then be sick for New Year's thing. So if I sound like I have party girl voice, that's why, minus the party part. But yes.
You sound great to me. So
Thanks.
For the listeners, appreciate the disclaimer. Yeah, if it's cool with you, I love turning the tables on you and we can dive in. And true to your podcast form, do you want to share a little bit about what you're excited to go into?
Actually, something that people may not know about me is that I spent the better part of my growing up in what I call the best of both worlds. The best of both worlds is not that my parents got separated when I was 5, but they did, and that was also okay, and it was meant to be. As a result of them getting separated, I spent the weekdays with my mom in Fort Lee, New Jersey, which, if you don't know, is right outside of Manhattan. So high-rise buildings. I lived on the 23rd floor of a big, tall building, and my mom moved us in this building in particular so that I'd have access to lots of other kids. We actually went down the hallways and listened for the sounds of kids to make sure we were picking the right apartment building. Then on the weekends, I would go with my dad, and he had a cottage in the woods in Woodstock, New York, with no electricity. Some of the best times of my life were spent there with him. The walk to the cottage was a quarter of a mile from the road. Maybe I'm making that up, but you couldn't see it from the road. And you walk down this little narrow path over 2 footbridges, over 2 different streams, and you got to this adorable cottage that the previous owner had built by hand from pieces of old churches. It was all kerosene heaters and a Franklin stove and candles and Bunsen burners. No connection to the outside world with the exception of sometimes a radio, good old school boombox with 500 D batteries that you had to put into it. And the quality time that we got to enjoy with each other there was playing in the meadow and swinging in the hammock over one of the streams and playing wiffle ball. Yeah. What's that?
Catching fireflies.
Fireflies, all of it, right? So the balance of the two, having this metropolitan active weekday experience and then this really cool, mellow, throwback, just old school experience with my dad was really great. So that was my best of both worlds story.
Lovely contrast. Yeah. That's amazing. For our listeners, can you recap again what your professional current status is in addition to this podcast? I know you do many things.
Yes, I am an executive coach. My niche is specifically helping underrepresented people confidently thrive in their careers by being fully themselves, which was bringing together my lived personal and professional experiences, and really just so thrilled to be immersed in the coaching world and grateful that I stumbled upon it after decades in the media advertising space as a sales leader, which I also loved. But it was one chapter, and then I'm just so grateful to be in this chapter now.
We're very fortunate to have you. I know you've worked with different individuals and really helped them transform their phase of life. And then also, true to this podcast, you're helping people navigate challenging situations. And how do they show up as individuals? How do they show up in their truth? How can they connect authentically with sharing value that lights them up? And so I think it's amazing that you started this podcast and you are really committed to an audience that you have personal experience with. And so you're not just sharing your intellectual knowledge, which is vast, but you're also sharing your authentic self, which helps people relate, it helps connect. And this whole idea of just the humanity and how we're helping each other and sharing stories so that, again, we don't feel alone.
Yeah.
I have been listening to obviously your interviews and your episodes, and what a unique set of vulnerable shares. Not one interviewee has been the same or come to the table with same set of situation or circumstances. And each one, I just got goosebumps as I'm saying it, like just brought to light something that I was like, whoa, that is just so resonant and so true and so powerful. 10 episodes in, what have been some of your aha moments?
An aha moment for me ties back to what you're saying, vulnerability, which I'll come back to, which is so key to me in this whole experience, but the breadth of the stories. And what's interesting is, of these people that I've interviewed, some are people that I've only met relatively recently, and some are people that I've known for quite a while. And in all cases, I'm learning these stories that just blow my mind. It led me to think about, why does it take a podcast, right? In other words, people have these stories, and in the cases of people that I might not know as well, the opportunity to just jump in within the context of a podcast and ask these questions and have this open dialogue. And then in the case of people I know, I've learned things that I didn't know before, or things that maybe we've skirted around, but we never fully got to. So 2 quick examples with Amy Bobchek. She told this really powerful story about her mom being an ally. I never knew that story. It's one of my favorite stories of the year, right? This finger shaking. How dare you assume I would think the way you do about things? And it's so powerful. And then I knew she had worked with coaches like myself before, but I didn't know that it was her work with a coach, her deep transformative work with a coach, that led her from being a know-it-all to being open-minded and curious and making a turn that she felt ultimately probably saved her career, because it wasn't going well the other way. Didn't know that story. And then so it leads me to think about, why don't we have these conversations? And I'll say myself, why am I not having these conversations? How did I miss that opportunity with Amy? With Farah, we talked a lot about these walls that she'd been building at work, and I had been a part of that experience with her. And I had this idea about where it might have come from, and somehow never managed to broach that conversation with her. And so it took the podcast for us to finally have that conversation, which for me was so profound. So it leads me to believe for myself that there's an opportunity to ask deeper questions in a really just loving, curious way. I think that we don't ask questions because maybe we're afraid of overstepping, we're afraid of prying. Maybe we don't offer our own stories and we put up some walls because of things that we're carrying ourselves, and people can kind of sense, don't go there. But the opportunity to ask questions, if it's someone that you know, you can say, hey, just curious, is there a story you haven't told me that was really a central part of your formation and that's really shaped who you are? I would love to hear it if you're open to sharing it, because I love you and I think so highly of you. And if it's someone that you don't know, just to say, hey, I'm just curious. I see you do cool things in the world, and I see how you show up, and I see the impact you're having. Is there something that you wish I or other people might learn from your experiences? And that's really the conversations we're having, but I'm having them on the podcast. I'm not saying I never have them in real life, but I'm seeing the opportunity, the aha opportunity to really lean in and do that more often. And it's so rewarding.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the story that you shared in the beginning about the contrast that you had in your life, right? The hustle and bustle, and doesn't get any faster pace than living on the edge of NYC. And then also retreating to the country and being without power and really living of the land, right? Those polar opposites showed you how to slow down and appreciate both worlds. And I think sometimes the stories that we haven't shared are also that result of us not slowing down. And this podcast is an amazing portal to say, we actually care about these stories. We're interested, and we have listeners that are tuning in because they want to connect with you on a more human level. I love that you're creating that sacred space for them, that your guests have felt safe to be authentic and to be vulnerable, and just the power of the diversity. It's amazing, the scope and breadth, and that's what this world is about. So kudos to you for engaging with the variety of guests that you have and being really mindful. Obviously, I know you, and just looking at the very different aspects of being underrepresented, you're very intentional. And listeners, here's a little plug for Shanti. If you have a story that you want to share and that you want to slow down and bring to light, reach out to Shanti so that you can be featured on this podcast and we can continue to just circulate this amazing, heartfelt content and help people realize that it is okay to share, even if you're not asked the question. If you just feel called to do it, then go after it. I'm sure that as you listen, Shanti, there are stories that are coming up for you that you're like, wow, I forgot that happened to me or something similar. So I would love to hear maybe just one story about something that you haven't had the opportunity to share because you've been focused on interviewing your guests. But again, over 10 episodes in, it's probably a good time to re-engage on your experience and the conversation that you bring. And before you start that story, can you share your pronouns? So again, we can set the table.
Yeah, my pronouns are she, her, and I am a gay, white, cisgender, able-bodied woman.
Like it. Okay.
Yes.
So what's the story that you have for us?
In the very first episode, I talked about my coming out at work stories. I prefaced that by saying that prior to those couple moments, I had spent the better part of 10 years ducking, hiding, contorting in some really interesting ways to essentially hide the fact that I was gay. So I thought I'd take a step back and talk about that a little bit. It was in the mid-90s that this was really starting to unfold. I was beginning my relationship with my now wife, Natalie. And to make it a little more interesting, we both worked at the same company. We were colleagues, so it wasn't that one of us was working for the other. Good old-fashioned office romance, except for that little twist, right?
Yeah.
I realized that a lot of us in the LGBTQ plus community talk about pre-Ellen, post-Ellen as a benchmark, but this was pre-Ellen. And it did not feel at all safe at work. I've described this time as the Wild West. Pre-Ellen did not feel safe, right?
Yeah.
The thing that was very clarifying for me was in this relationship, what I knew as I really settled into it and understood it was that I felt I owed it to myself to feel the way that I felt about Natalie, about whomever I might be with in my life. And this was after some soul searching. That's another story for maybe the next time we're together. But that clarified everything for me. And it gave me the courage and the strength to know that despite all of this fear and uncertainty, this was absolutely something that was non-negotiable in a really good way. So in the early days of our relationship, one of the things that Natalie and I would discuss is we could get fired for this. Do you still want to keep going? Which is, it's interesting. I said it wasn't until I really sat back this past year and thought about my life and my trajectory that I realized the extent to which my journey was really an outsider's journey. Because I was me and I was doing the things, but that's not a normal conversation to have. And so we would have it. And thank goodness we kept answering yes. And we would have this conversation from time to time. Hey, just checking in. And as it got more and more real and as more and more time went on, and frankly, as more and more people might start to suspect, hey, are we still good here? Because this could not end well from a career standpoint. So that was interesting. That was a part of the active dialogue. And then the other thing that really marked this time was this feeling of needing to hide from a safety standpoint. And yet you have a life, and I'm very honest by nature. We all are. No one really wants to be lying, but you're in this position where you're feeling that you have to hide. Yeah. And so a conversation might be, Mary asks me, how was your weekend? Oh, it was great. We went to the park and we had a sandwich, and then we went for a walk, and then they did X, and you're having this conversation, and at no point have you said who they is. there's no context, right? So a lot of this was just a weird tightrope act of splitting the difference and doing the best I could. I mean, I had to have an answer to the question, what'd you do this weekend? I wasn't going to sit and completely fabricate an answer. So the best I could do was just skip all of the important details and start talking about it as if we all knew what I was talking about. So the whole we, they thing was really weird, really exhausting. And I know that's not something unique to Natalie and me. That's something that people in this kind of position go through. At one point, I was confronted about it. Somewhat friendly confrontation, someone I had a bit of a rapport with, yet it was still being done in a, hey, this is what people think's going on kind of way. It wasn't bathed in love and understanding. It was more like inquiring minds want to know, and this is what people are saying. And but you may want to address it because if you don't, people are going to keep thinking it. And I flat out lied and said, nope, wrong. It's not happening. People think it. That's fine. Let people think what they want to think. But do I feel badly about having done that? No. Would I do it differently now? Given that point in time? No, because I didn't feel safe. Did it feel really crappy to do? Yeah, it did. It really did. So there were a lot of those kinds of moments. And the other way I've described it is it's like a filter that's constantly running, or almost like radar that's constantly scanning the environment to determine, am I safe, and anticipate what might I be asked, or what situation might I be in where I need to really think about how I'm going to respond. Sometimes you're aware that filter is running and sometimes you're not, but it's always running. And I'm going to keep using the word exhausting, but it's exhausting. It was a very interesting time. I mentioned this last time you asked the question. It was lonely too. We didn't have a community. And we felt like we were charting new ground, although we weren't, and just against the way you want to live, which is just to be able to share things with people that matter to you without even having to think about it. That was a lot of it. Of course, there's a funny story to go with it. But before I jump right into that, I'm wondering what's coming up for you as I'm talking about all of it.
So many things, because as I listened to like your episode with Ruth, which was about disabilities. There's that thread of shame. There's a thread of not being understood, of feeling like you have to hide a part of yourself. Yeah. And then there's also this whole relatability, because I would say that as a single hetero woman in corporate America, there was plenty of parts of me that I felt like I had to hide from that workforce because it would have been judged. Or again, you talk about like work romances. There was always a stigma that it was okay for the guys, but the minute a woman was revealed that she might have been involved in something, let alone a non-hetero relationship, there was judgment, right? There was more chatter, and it was all focused or directed at that underrepresented individual. So I can feel to some degree the concept of weaving the story in such a way that you're trying to be as truthful and as honest, but also maintaining a safe distance, because you never know who was coming at you, or with that information in the wrong person's hands that's judgmental, or that's destructive, or that's jealous of something that you have. What could they do with that information? That's a toxic environment, but you also have a career to maintain and you need to pay the bills. And so you do it as best of your ability. And so it's always that hindsight, you looking back and going, okay, I have a funny story that I'm going to share in a second. But in that moment, relationships in general are hard enough as it is. You add that layer of complexity, and it is kudos to you and Natalie for being able to authentically keep checking in with each other, maintaining some insulation from the outside world of their impact to you and your career and your growing relationship. It's so hard. And knowing you guys the way I do now, I'm so glad that didn't take a negative turn, that you were able to manage it in such a healthy way, and that it's actually grown you and made you more unified. So kudos to you guys.
Oh, thank you for that. Yeah, oh man, I look back and I just have this overwhelming feeling of, I'm so glad that chapter's in the rearview mirror. And that piece of that chapter, the rest of that chapter was phenomenal, right? It was, that was kind of us starting to build our life together. But yeah, that piece of it was heavy for sure.
Complex and exhausting. As you were talking, I could feel the weight of it and the weight of navigating the conversation and still being true to yourself.
Yeah.
So what's the funny story? I want to know the funny story.
Yeah. So I said, that I'm a truthful person. My parents raised me to be, obviously. And then the other piece of it is, as much as I'd like to say I'm truthful because I'm a good person, I'm also truthful because I don't get away with anything. And so just as an example of that, Natalie and I lived in Manhattan. The company was based in, the offices were in Manhattan. We were out on Long Island because her best friend had just had a baby. And so we went to the hospital to be there for that. And we stayed at a hotel nearby, and we're sitting in the hotel at the bar, and we were having a drink. And I looked to my left. I can picture this whole thing. And I see someone coming toward me, and the president of the company that we worked for had a very distinctive walk. And I'm looking, and it's like this rubbing your eyes. I'm like, I can't be seeing him. And then I said, Nat, you're not going to believe who's walking toward us. And so she looked, and sure enough, I said, all right, you go talk to him and I'll figure out how to disappear. She went to run interference. I'm like throwing money down on the bar. I'm grabbing our drinks. It's like an I Love Lucy episode. I'm moving fast and going in circles because I'm also not very good under pressure and things like that. So I'm being clumsy and circling, and drinks are swirling. And I made a beeline for the room and got in there and just couldn't even breathe. I mean, look, I said I don't get away with anything. I don't know that he ever saw me, but I can't know that for sure. But the chances of being out in the middle of Long Island and bumping into him was just like, oh, that's me. And I have other stories like that, but that's at the top of my list.
It's so true. My mom and I always laugh because there was a point when I was in high school, I got busted for something. And my mom's infamous line that really changed my life in one way was, she said, Mary, you know how there are people that can get away with things in life? And I'm like, yeah, sure. My little sister Jade, I start rattling off people who can get away with things. And she goes, yes, exactly. When are you going to realize you are not one of them? So I was like, huh. Not. I get busted for everything. Change the trajectory, because anytime my friends are up to mischief, I'd be like, if you want to get busted, include me. And literally they would be like, oh, that's right. Meredith's not lucky. Leave her out of this. Like,
I didn't realize this about myself until later in life. I should have had the foresight to warn my friends similarly. In high school, friends of mine somehow got a copy of a test in advance. And so they were looking at the answers to the test before the test. And they said, do you want, nope, I'm good. So we're in taking the test. And my friend who had it, the advanced copy, looks at me and just like wink, wink, and just flashes it at me like, eh.
Yeah.
And I looked from him toward the front of the room, and based on the look on my face, the teacher walked over to my friend, pulled out the advanced copy of the test, and pulled him off by the ear to the principals. I mean, he got completely busted just because of the look on my face.
Everybody run from Shanti and I if you're up to mischief.
That's right.
No,
that's right.
It's not going to be in the bag at all. So that's okay. And thankfully, we're both at a place where I feel safe. How has that changed for you now? I guess is a good question. Where do you see yourself, and are you holding back in any area of your life that you once felt you had to protect?
That's a good question. I'm pretty far along the trajectory, the introspection that I had, and then identifying my niche, working with underrepresented people, and really the epiphanies that I had about that. And then me sharing that with my broader professional network. And frankly, then doing this podcast. If you had asked me 2 years ago if I thought I'd be doing this podcast comfortably, no, that would have seemed like just a little bit too much exposure, too much vulnerability. Yeah. So I've come a long way. Eduardo and I discussed this, and Ruth and I discussed it. Coming out never ends. If you're an outsider and there's something that you feel you need to hide, that's very likely an ongoing process for you. Even just thinking about stories I might want to share with you today, there are more to come, and I had to check myself. And in one case, I even reached out to a friend and said, I'm thinking of sharing this. Does that feel safe to you? Yeah. And so I've come a long way, and I don't think it'll ever fully end. And I think that's also okay. I think it's part of the journey. But yeah, it's been a lot of opening up and first being aware of my own story for myself before I could then decide if I was ready to share it. And the ready to share it wasn't really ready, more about like feeling called to and wanting to, so that we could be here doing this.
Yeah. And I think there's also a little bit about what are stories to share that are helpful to us and then in service of others, right?
Yeah.
And then what are stories or aspects of ourselves that we don't need to share? I know that there is still, sadly, some unsafe feelings related to whether or not you were vaccinated with COVID or not. That was a big heightened, a lot of judgment, a lot of strong personalities. When you look at the political realm, again, a lot of different individuals that don't feel safe or feel one way or the other that are very vocal. And so it's almost as a culture, we're constantly trying to navigate. We're not always going to feel safe, even if we're comfortable in our own skin, because these issues are going to arise. And it's okay to have your own individual experience and individual opinion. And how do we just hold a safe space for those differences too?
Yeah, I think Justin Ayers talked about there's a time and a place to come out about whatever it might be. And in some cases, to your point, it might not be important in a particular context or setting ever. The important part is the internal self-love, self-acceptance, being at peace, being authentic, loving who you are. That's the most important part. Yeah. And then you can decide who to share that with, depending on the circumstances. But yeah, look, that was another thing Ruth Rathbott talked about, the many ways that people hide, and that it's not just the traditional ways that we think about. And she hid her limb difference for 25 years. And now if you look at her on camera or in any situation, she's waving her limb difference to make a point, which is most of us are hiding something. And it's not just in the ways that you might think of. And people aren't thinking about disability in the same way that they're probably thinking about being LGBTQ plus or being Black. It's not entering the diversity conversation in the same way. And she wants to make sure that's changing. And then went through this whole list of ways that people hide that she's made other people comfortable to talk about. So it could be their financial status or their educational level or a health issue or difficult relationships in their family, right? It just, the list goes on, but that was eye-opening for me to really think about the many different ways that people are hiding. And to your point, I think the best that we can do is to try to create these spaces where people feel safe to talk about what they want to talk about if and when they're ready. Yeah. That's the piece that we can control. So that's a lot about making connections, being present, being open, being deeply curious, approaching people with care and kindness. That's the piece of it that we own.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And then also just realizing there's no shame in it either. I know I have 2 friends right now that are struggling and managing a divorce. And I shared that I have been divorced, and it's not something I go out and beat a drum about. It was an experience that was one of the hardest things I've ever been through. And there was a lot of pain and shame and different things I had to work through. And now I share in a way because I can see someone else hurting and I can empathize with them. And it helps them realize that, yes, it is one of the hardest things that an individual has to go through. And once you're through the worst of it, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And so it also offers hope, right? Because in the moment, you're in so much despair or struggle or grief because your life isn't turning out the way you hope. And so is there someone else you can lean on to feel supported in one of your most vulnerable areas? So hopefully, I think as people listen to your podcast, that's the other thing that you're doing for them, is that if they're in a situation where they have had a bad experience with a medical professional who made them feel shame, or if you're a veteran, that whole conversation of helping transition back into reality or not feeling shame around different substance abuse programs that are, again, available. It's just nice that you're helping bring that connection and that voice and allowing people to find the community that feels resonant to them.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think you mentioned it early on, and kind of thinking about our podcast together. And the thing that strikes me the most is that vulnerability that you referenced and the depths of the vulnerability with which people are sharing. That's caught me by surprise in a beautiful way. I expected to have some interesting conversations. I expected to cover some topics and ground that was new. I knew I would learn, and I was excited about that. But the ways that people are being vulnerable are mind-boggling to me. And I thought maybe the first episode, maybe I got lucky, and then it happened again and again. And Caramelli sharing childhood trauma for the first time on the podcast still takes my breath away that she chose to do that.
Yeah.
And
she is a strong woman.
Ooh.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And she, as with really all of the guests, did it wanting to be of service, right? Here's my story. Here's where the challenges were. Here's where it took me. And she said it. Brett, the veteran, said it, that they'd do it all over again, trauma included. And Caramelli said, I don't mean that in a gaslighting kind of way. Oh, it was meant to be. But she really feels that her purpose on this planet is to help people and to be able to do it from a place of understanding what it can be to go from despair to, as she describes it, filling up her cup and serving from the overflow, which means loving herself so much that it just flows out on to other people. And she wouldn't have found that depth of overflow had she not been through the experiences that she went through, including the difficult ones. And Brett, veteran, like I'm a veteran, and to have the courage to first ask for help for himself despite all of the stigma, and then to come out on the other side of still what I don't understand how he possibly came out on the other side of, given what he went through in Afghanistan, and now be an advocate for helping other people be okay to, beyond okay to, show the bravery of asking for help and working on your mental health and understanding how many resources there are. And it just goes on and on. Justin talking about a dermatologist that found out he was gay and wouldn't touch his skin and how dirty and ashamed it made him feel. I didn't expect to hear that story. The fact that not only are they talking about them, but talking about them in a very public forum and really just so dedicated to having their stories be powerful, to turn them on their heads and be examples of what's possible and be of service is amazing to me. And I'm just always grateful, continuously grateful. I've done a lot of cool things in my life, but this podcast and the opportunity to be on the receiving end of the depths and the vulnerability and the stories that I'm hearing is beyond anything I imagined going into it.
Yeah, it's powerful. It's been powerful to watch you on this journey, to listen to all of these great, amazing guests that you're having on the podcast, and also just hear not just vulnerability, but compassion.
Yeah.
There's a true compassion that they have in their voice, sharing their story, and then also owning anything that might happen to them on a human level. I think it was Brett was like, I'm human. Sometimes I am not as patient with this audience as I need to be. And I have to remind myself that we all have bad days. And so I also love the fact that no one is showing up as a victim. They're all owning their story and then using it as a way to help others and to be compassionate and to be understanding and also feel seen and also share the work that they've done in order to get to the point that they're at. And then also just that humanity of we're still evolving, right? We still have some ways to go in this and open up more doors.
Yeah. And one more that as you were speaking just reminded me was Farrah Hudson Brown talking about these walls as a Black woman that she had built up, and she had adopted this going to be easy to get along with and going to make my supervisors feel safe. And as she did this over time, she was developing resentment she didn't even realize she had. And so she went from having these walls, which then included putting the responsibility of her happiness and her fulfillment and her success on other people, to this idea of what's the feeling of my best self?
Yeah.
Realizing that it was all about inside. It wasn't finding happiness or fulfillment externally. And then she hit me with, And if I had known that sooner, then I could have added the flavor at work. I could have been the salt at work. I was like, God, that's not brilliant. It's just amazing to have her share this journey and then put these beautiful words to it. And I'm going to just keep talking about things as I remember them. Kelly Campbell and the pronouns and gender fluidity. It was the first episode after the one you and I did. And of course, I thought about pronouns and I understand the idea of pronouns. Hearing language to it in such an eloquent and accessible way, and to be able to understand it at a much deeper, more profound, more beautiful level. And I thought, man, it's so cool that you're talking about it. That's why we're doing the podcast, because you're talking about it and you're doing it so beautifully. Yeah, it just goes on. And I continue to be amazed by what I'm hearing and experiencing because of everyone's generosity.
Yeah. It's generous of time, generous of spirit, generous of nature, generous of humanity. So yeah, kudos to you and all of your guests for bringing forth conversations that need to be shared, for sharing stories that are relatable, that help us connect or help us get curious, help us maybe advocate for someone in a way that we didn't understand before, or just hold space for someone to see what might be happening in their life. The other thing I really appreciated about Farah's story was just that you noticed that some of her light was dim. How often in life do we have the ability to interact with someone and then we notice a shift in them? And can we help re-energize them by just acknowledging? If you feel comfortable sharing, great. If you don't, that's okay too. But I just want you to know I see you. Maybe it's not stories we need to share. Maybe it's just space sometimes. So I love this community of listeners and campfire gatherers. And since we are sitting around the campfire, I know that it's your podcast. And so there will be music. So is there a song right now that is inspiring you or lighting you up that you want to include in this time capsule?
Yeah. Do you want to guess who the artist is?
I could, but I don't think that's fun for your listeners. But is it Indigo Girls?
It is. It's my podcast, so I'll use them twice, if not more. Yeah, so this song is Indigo Girls, and it's called Fugitive. And the original song that I spotlighted was Emily's song. This one is an Amy song. And if you know them at all, or if you don't, but her voice is just so powerful and rich. And this particular song has always been a favorite. And it starts with, I'm harboring a fugitive, a defector of a kind. And so I don't know what she meant when she wrote it, but for me, it's harboring a fugitive, right? It's that thing that you are hiding inside of you. And then she specifically says, so hide yourself for me. I've always sung that lyric and it's meant a lot to me. And then I think specifically just having interviewed Ruth Rathblad and talking about hiding and unhiding, it hit me in the face that it was there when I looked at it fresh. So there's the hiding, and then there's this moment in the song where Amy is on a beach with the person that she's with, and they're having this moment of just letting all of the walls down. There's a freedom that she talks about. I was aching with freedom and kissing the damned. And Ruth and I talked about that, right? The unhiding comes with this freedom that is just so beautiful. Then ultimately, there's a lyric that says, it's all in our hands, got to learn to respect what we don't understand. And that's always meant the world to me. I think that's at the heart of this podcast, learn to respect what we don't understand and show up with that curiosity. Amy Bobchek talked about the open-mindedness and the wanting to learn. The song is powerful. It's beautiful. It's raw. It's always been a favorite. And as I listen to it fresh now, just more so than ever.
Yeah, I love that. It's always nice when you can think about the lyrics or listen to a song from a different vantage point, because we're always in different places too. I was chatting with a friend about how there was a book that was recommended to me, and it wasn't until a later phase of life that I really saw the beauty in that book. And those other times I picked it up, I just couldn't connect with it. And similarly, I feel like songs have that power too. When we first hear the song, we might think about a breakup or think about something we were going through. And then you listen to it at a different phase of life and you're like, wow, that has a completely different meaning to me. That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing.
Of course.
For your listeners, can you remind them all the ways that they can get in touch with you?
Yeah, easiest is shantijoygold.com. That's my website. You can also navigate there through the podcast, storieswehaven'tshared.com. But that's where you'll find more about the work that I do as an executive coach, the podcast itself. LinkedIn's a big spot for me as well. Shanti Joy Gold there. So yeah. And can you please do the same because you're amazing. How many episodes now of your podcast?
Of the True Stride podcast, we have 233, I think, right now.
He's crazy.
It's been a wild and fun journey. And yeah, I do solo episodes as well as interview guests. And so I'm always amazed at the stories that surface when I have guests on my podcast too. And so I think we just have to keep sharing. I think we have to keep connecting and have that respect that you just talked about. It's like when we can respect someone else's experience, it doesn't have to be our own, but that respect, I think, will get us a long way towards humanity.
No doubt. And where can people find you, please?
MaryTessRooney.com is probably the easiest. So.
Beautiful. Yeah. I couldn't be more grateful for you being here today. And more importantly, just being a part of my life and my journey. And what a great way to start off the year. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And listeners, you guys have stories to share. So reach out to Shanti. We want to hear them and have you featured on this amazing podcast, Stories We Haven't Shared.
Thanks, Mary. All right, everyone. That brings this episode of Stories We Haven't Shared to a close. I believe stories are our humanity waiting to be shared, and listening makes it possible. Thanks so much for being here by our virtual campfire today. Until next time. And thank you, Mary. See ya.
Thanks, all.